Good morning and welcome to the Big Buzz Breakfast Club. We are excited to be talking about wellness in the workplace today and taking care of your most valuable asset. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being recorded and it will be shared with you by the end of today, along with some additional resources on the topic that have come from our panelists. We are excited to continue to help you be able to improve the culture and the work in your organizations by sharing these resources with you, and thank our panelists for all that they've given for their time today and also those resources to help us help you. Also, you can put any questions today in the Q&A box. Questions will be answered at the end of the session. Many registration participants have also submitted questions, and we have those on our list, and we'll do our very best in the time allotted to make sure that all of those are covered as well. And also, in an effort to be more inclusive, we have the closed captioning available for participants who might need it. If you'd like to turn it off, simply click the button on your screen to do that for yourself. I'm Melissa Legowski, founder, CEO of Big Buzz Idea Group, and we are excited to be able to bring the Big Buzz Breakfast Club to you. Big Buzz knows that many nonprofit executives lack the time, staff, skills, and funding that they need to do their most important work. Big Buzz Idea Group fills gaps in management, marketing, and events so that you can focus on the big picture and position your organization to thrive. Each month, we bring the Big Buzz Breakfast Club to you at no cost as an effort to help you continue to educate and grow in your role in your nonprofit organization so that you can all make a bigger impact in the world. We are honored and delighted to be able to support nonprofit professionals in their journeys. Our panelists today have been carefully selected from our partners and people that we work with as members of a community that we know they are dealing with a lot of high stress environments, and that we believe that their perspective and their resources and information are going to really help us be able to elevate this conversation today. We have Allison Herman, who is the Director of Education for Hope for the Day. We have Bernard Mariano, who is the Chief of Staff at Between Friends. And we have Katrina Wright, the Chief Human Resources Officer at Trilogy. At this time, I'm going to start by letting the panelists tell you a little bit about themselves. They each have a unique perspective that I think will lend a lot to the conversation. And so they will just, we'll start with you, Allison, if you could tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so as Melissa said, I'm the Director of Education at Hope for the Day. Hope for the Day is a nonprofit focusing on mental health education and suicide prevention. I've been with the org. I started as a volunteer in 2018, 2019. And then how I like to do the shortcut of my story is I just kept asking them if they would like me to be in their official org, and they finally agreed to pay me. So before I did nonprofit work, I did 11 years in advertising. So I'm used to a really fast-paced, sometimes very toxic work environment. And it's really nice to switch over to a little bit more of a passion-driven organization.
Thank you. Bernard.
Yes, my name is Bernard Mariano. I'm the Chief of Staff at Between Friends. Similarly, I also started at Between Friends as a volunteer, and slowly over, I think the financial director just came up to me one day and was like, "I heard you do payroll," and I was like, kind of as a side gig, and that's kind of how it all started. But prior to my work in the domestic violence sphere and providing support services to survivors and their families, I kind of pivoted away from the nonprofit legal world, which has its own culture and views on self-care that did not agree with me. So I'm glad to be part of the influencing force in how we treat our staff and each other, and kind of modeling a healthier lifestyle, especially with the last 2 years that we've been going through.
Thank you, Bernard. Katrina.
Yes, good morning to everyone. I'm Katrina Wright. I work for a fantastic organization, Trilogy Behavioral Healthcare. I'm fairly new to the organization. I've been there just a couple of months in a new role, created really to focus in on the employee experience. I spent over 20 years in the for-profit industry, and after a kind of tumultuous job elimination experience of my own, but also um, being supportive of some employees as I exited out, I wanted to look at doing some work in organizations that, like the other panelists I had been involved in from volunteer standpoint. I sit on a couple of boards of nonprofit. So I turned my attention to looking at how we support our employees that do the great, terrific, and often underappreciated work in our non-for-profit environment. So I found myself at Trilogy. I'm already working on a new employee experience strategy, which includes engagement. And our engagement includes a specific focus on mental wellness. So I'm excited to be here and talk with you about that today.
Thank you, Katrina. I really like, I think setting that landscape, when I started in the nonprofit space myself as an executive director, I was a staff of one. I had really it was just my day-to-day experiences that really framed kind of my landscape. And all too often, I think there is that toxicity that the nonprofit space is known for. And I think, Bernard, I loved hearing you talk about the fact that we have choices, right? I think a big part of this is kind of recognizing that we have a voice, we have choices, and we have to listen and be aware of ourselves and others around us. And I continue to think that what I've seen, I'm dating myself a bit, but when it used to kind of talk about mental illness, I continue to think that really this is all about a spectrum of mental wellness. And I really continue to think that we can be anywhere on that spectrum at any given moment in any given day based on whatever external factors, internal factors might be taking place. And so kind of the first question that I would like to cover today is, I know that sometimes in the world, this toxic tendencies tend to be normalized. People think they don't have choices or options. What was your organization doing to promote the mental wellness of your staff prior to the pandemic?
I can start. I'm going to be honest. We did a lot of external programming, and we hope that that was the education that our staff also got, but we weren't putting a lot of intentional emphasis on our internal staff pre-pandemic. And I think it's really interesting because the world changed. I like to call it like the before times and then the now. And in the before times, like people got to do a lot of different things that they can't do anymore or can't do as easily anymore. So I'm going to say that we had a lot of really wonderful external programming, but then we also didn't really put a lot of emphasis on our internal staff as we should have.
Thank you for being honest about that, because I do think it's come into a new light, and it tends to be that same old, when we know better, we can do better. Bernard, Katrina, would one of you like to comment?
Yeah, I'll just mention I worked for a non-for-profit for 3 years before my new role here at Trilogy. And I'll just say in spaces pre-pandemic, to Allison's point, we utilized, we depended on our EAP, but didn't utilize it very often. So from a workforce standpoint, we had about 10% utilization of our EAP providers. And we had some employee resource groups going, we had some employee activity groups going to try and keep the work environment pleasant for individuals. The interesting thing, however, is when the burnout would come up, even in situations where performance reviews were occurring, we were still focusing very much on solely that productivity, the quantity and quality, which sometimes led to utilizing things like performance improvement plans, or even, and I shudder at this term, progressive disciplinary measures when targets weren't being met. And I don't know that we really realized even the, stigma or emphasis or harm that even those terms and the way that we were looking at them were affecting our employees. We continue to promote the idea that being very busy and being super achieving and being super type A was rewarded and looked at being burnt out or tired as almost a performance issue. And that was very, very concerning. And we realized, I think the pandemic had something to do with it, that we had to look at things differently.
Katrina, can you, for those who might be participating today and aren't familiar with the term EAP, can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Sure. I mean, I won't say most, many organizations have employee assistance programs where outside organizations provide supportive services to employees, focus oftentimes around mental wellness opportunities. And we found that the groups or the organizations that we would partner with typically did not necessarily understand the culture. Very nice people who wanted to provide very supportive services, but they weren't necessarily super aware of the types of roles that we had in our organization, the environment or the culture, and the experiences that some individuals were having within the workspace and of course in their personal lives. And we found that utilization sometimes was low. And even though we did things like lunch and learns to help boost that utilization, I think many of our employees at times found it to be a little bit impersonal. And there was still a great amount of stigma around, hey, I know you said that this is going to be confidential, but people are going to know I'm using EAP. They're going to make stories up in their heads, and I'm not going to be that super achiever. I'm going to be the employee with the problem. And so that became more of an internal stigmatized conversation. And we had to look at, number one, rebranding the way we promote EAP in the environment, but also looking at doing some things internally, which included even stuff like peer counseling to help support and augment some of the services we were offering under our employee benefits.
Thank you for helping to explain that. And then I know, Bernard, in working with Between Friends, we talk a lot about vicarious trauma and the fact that, you know, all of you, right, have that vicarious trauma. It's a term I had not been as familiar with until I was introduced to some of your organizations. And it is where you're in those kind of high stress industries. And so automatically, right, when you're helping others who are really in crisis or in need, it kind of impacts, right, even the counselor, the therapist, the staff, because it's a lot, right? You're carrying your own load and someone else's load too. And so Bernard, I know with the domestic violence at Between Friends, I'd love to know what you guys were doing around some of this pre-pandemic. Would you share your thoughts?
I think we are very unique in the way that the beach is also maybe like 10, 15 minutes away from where our office was located. This is the first organization where if the weather was really nice outside and the counseling team just wasn't feeling the conference room, they took the bus down to the beach and had a beach meeting and lunch, and they invited me, who had no connection to them other than like I was taking like office supply orders, and they're like, yeah, come on down. And you know, I was just like, wow, this really is different. And then when I told my supervisor about that, she had been on board. It's like, wow, we should do that for our next one. So it kind of turned into this like really great opportunity to either, you know, for a change of pace, we would go to different locations. We might go to like a Starbucks and work there for a change of pace instead of being in the office all day. That way, when we did have to be at the office and didn't have as much freedom because we had like a lot of deadlines to meet or we had to do a lot of printing that way, it didn't feel like we had just been at the office for forever. There's a lot of flexibility in where we could kind of have a change of pace and a change of how meetings were kind of conducted. I learned a lot from how other directors ran their meetings, and a lot of them were really kind of like, yeah, how you mentioned this last week, how's that hobby that you picked up kind of situation, instead of like, my favorite color is blue and I like to read books in general. Like people would follow up like the next week and were actually really interested in hobbies people had picked up.
That's great. Thank you very much for sharing that. And I think sometimes, right, we have to have the courage to be, to just suggest something different and start to introduce it, because it can start to change everything. But so the pandemic has, it's been difficult and challenging. I think one of the more positive outcomes is this reframing of mental wellness and the realization, right, that we all have to be more aware. We all have the ability to kind of talk about it, be aware of it. But I'd like to ask you all now, kind of looking before the pandemic and what was going on within your organizations, how has the pandemic changed how you're caring for your teams and your employees?
One of the things that was concerning to us, half of our organization, we have about 425 employees, half of our organization, or more than half, are direct care clinical staff in acute crisis situations. The pandemic hits, and people aren't necessarily being able to see their clients as much or touch their clients. And so what we found, however, was that the virtual space and the virtual environment, kind of moving into much of that as possible, still continue to be a very successful resource for our clients. Our employees, however, still were, experiencing a great amount of stress in terms of that connectivity. And so we wanted to try and find continued opportunities to increase the level of connectivity, that people still felt the need to reach out and to have important touch bases with our employees. And that was a big deal to us. However, we also started to try and use a change in language. I know it sounds very small, but something as small as performance management being changed to performance coaching, in the way we set up our routines and our learning and our training plans for our employees mattered a ton, because people were learning to manage their own lives in a different way. And leaders and C-suite employees don't manage the performance of employees. We're looking to support, remove barriers, and supply resources. And so even a change in language through the pandemic, and now on the other side, looking at changing the language that we have for our performance, employee performance programs, has been a huge indicator, and indicates some uptick in our employee engagement process.
Yeah, and I was going to say that we have a lot of benefits that that are new. So we had a change in leadership at the beginning of 2021. And also we started having a lot more empathy and transparency internally, just being very open about what's going on, being very mindful and inclusive. I mean, director of education, so I want people to know as much as they can know about what's going on out in the world. And one of those things was getting to know your staff, realizing who, and I know this ties back to your previous panel that you had, but like, who's on your staff? How is the world affecting them? Because we know the pandemic did not hit evenly. We know that people had different access to different resources. So often we would have conversations being like, hey, just so you know, now we have mental health Fridays at the end of every month, the last Friday of every month, don't be here. When we started looking at our vacation plan again, we're like, all right, minimum 2 weeks is what you need to take, with like unlimited vacation after that. My entire team is remote, and that was kind of an accident, because we started doing a lot of our educations and suicide prevention stuff on Zoom. And then I hired the people that were right for the job. And then I looked around and I realized that I had 3 different time zones and a lot of employees that were online. So our leadership team also put in place, learn how to schedule send emails, learn how to schedule send Slack messages, like get rid of the additional stress of like receiving an email at 1 a.m. from an executive person. Like make sure that we're starting to like create that space where people can actually leave. Because even if you say you don't have to respond to the email, there's that additional worry of if that's a trick or not in a lot of organizations. So that's something that I've really loved seeing. And if you have a leadership team and an executive team that actually follows those it then the lower level employees will start to realize like, oh, this is real. This is something I can actually do. And I've really enjoyed seeing that.
And I have to say, from the outside looking in, as somebody who's worked with the folks at Hope for the Day, they really had, when I first met them in 2021, they had that mindset that they had to always be on and always be available. They really were stretching themselves. And so, to Allison's point, I mean, I am just like doing cartwheels and jumping up and down on the inside at how they've added so many extra layers. And they had to really, I will add that they had to hold each other accountable, because some people couldn't break the old habits. But to Allison's point, because it was leadership top down, because it was everybody in the organization, it really started to impact that significantly. And it's just wonderful to hear where you guys have gone with it. Bernard, I know you guys have a lot of great things going on. So please, will you share some of that with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, during the pandemic, we definitely couldn't do things that are like, we have a party planning committee that would kind of once a quarter kind of try to figure out how, like, here's a nominal budget. How do you plan something fun for people to do and let their hair down? All of a sudden you can go bowling, you can go to a restaurant, you can do a lot of things. And our executive director, Cindy Williams, really kind of paved the way in kind of saying like, I really want to get people to do something together during this time. So she really kind of stepped up and set up like we did like a painting thing where all the supplies were mailed to everybody's addresses, and we had given everybody like a Grubhub credit for them to get lunch on the organization, to really kind of let them know that like, yeah, we can still do fun things and people can catch up. But more on the culture side of things, I think checking in with one another and really making sure that like, okay, how does your week look? And if someone's week is a little lighter on some days, just give it to them as kind of like a flex day. If like their workload kind of pours into the next day, and then check in on that day and see if they are feeling like they have nothing to do, or they're kind of at capacity. You don't know what other, depending on who's giving them tasks, you might not know which manager is giving them other things to do. Additionally, I know managers and directors advocate for their supervisees in a way of letting people know when we're in kind of like our busy season. Like if we're running through an audit, we'll tell people like, hey, just to let you know, we're getting audited and pulling things for reports. We might be asking people for things for the next couple of days. Please allow 1 to 2 business days for anyone on our team to respond to your emails, because at any point in time they could be asking for timesheets from 3 months ago that people are trying to scramble. So checking in and setting boundaries has been really helpful, especially when kind of during the beginning of the pandemic, I think people really tended to feel guilty. I'm working from home. This is like the thing, the holy grail of what I've always wanted. So I always have to be on, or always have to be, reachable. I took a 15-minute break to make a cup of coffee. I have to stay like an hour after work because I lost my train of thought, or I lost my the groove of whatever I was working on. So kind of telling people like, it's 5, stop working. I'm not going to ask you about anything after that.
Yeah, I think that the communications and the expectations are so important. And I think in a virtual world, we continue to talk internally here about how you have to really kind of more intentionally communicate. It's easy to be in our silos a little bit more, to even though we're on Zoom, right? But you show up, you do the matter at hand, and then you like separate. It's not like when you show up a couple minutes early, you have a little chit chat, you talk a few minutes afterwards. And so I think really sometimes we think everybody might be knowing what we're thinking or automatically know what's in our mind. And that intentionality of like, hey, I can get to this, but it's going to be a week. And sometimes, right, we self-impose extra deadlines too. I know that sometimes we think people want a response from us faster than they might actually want. And so, to just communicate, when do you need this, or I'll be able to turn this around in this time frame, it really helps create, I think, a little bit more positive energy and manage some of that. And then Bernard, I love what you said too, right? About, I think all of us in the nonprofit space, every organization I've ever seen, you have peaks and valleys and you have rushes and high demand times. But when you have those slowdowns or those quieter times, being able to capitalize and maybe give people an unexpected afternoon off or a day off, it can go a long way in recharging a battery. And it always reminds me of the anytime you're on an airplane, right? You've got to put your own oxygen mask on first before taking care of others, and which is a great segue. So I would love to know, I mean, we often get so focused on taking care of others on our teams. I know, like Allison doing all of that education, you guys are trying to empower and educate as many people every year as possible around how to have better conversations and suicide prevention. But what should we be aware of in protecting and preserving our own personal mental wellness? I would love to share thoughts on that today.
Yeah, I think the thing I think about the most in nonprofits is that, as Bernard said earlier, some of us start off as volunteers, and this was our side gig to get away from the corporate world. So realizing that, like, you have very passionate people that maybe got a job in a place that was their hobby, or that was their fun activity. So I like to remind my people, like, what are you doing outside of work? Because sometimes people aren't, and it's really helpful to have that additional manager moment of like, hey, are you reading a book on the weekends? Do you have another thing? Are you volunteering somewhere else? Are you starting to like fill your cup somewhere else? Because once your main gig gets really stressful or you're having a really tough time, you start to realize like, oh, I should be diversifying my options to make sure I'm at Hope for the Day. We call it valving out our pressure. So doing those self-care practices, making sure that you're not running yourself ragged. But it's really hard for nonprofits because you have people who are passionate. Like, I'm teaching mental health education and suicide prevention because it's what I've always wanted to do. So when someone's like, but what do you do with your free time? I'm like, I did this. This is what I did. So it's really helpful to like build that awareness and realize, like, are your employees working too much? Are you working too much? Do you have to set your own barriers to like start that conversation? Make sure you're setting a good example.
I completely agree. And I think that, kind of working in the human resources department, that's typically about, rules and plans and guidelines. So I can speak from that perspective. I mean, I think it's important to include volunteer time off for employees who have a passion and advocacy for things that they need to or want to accomplish outside of work. And if you don't mind, I'll go back to those check-ins. I think it's even important to find out, to Allison's point, what your staff likes to do. And sometimes talk about that or highlight that. Some scheduling, our CEO at Trilogy is wonderful in that sometimes her check-ins are just really about how are things going with you, and making sure, to your point, that we're talking about the things that you get to do outside of the space of your title. And so those check-ins, typically we're required in many of our healthcare and health services practices to have what we call weekly supervisions. And we're either talking tactical or we're talking developmental, but it's okay to simply talk. We're not suggesting that you have to have a personal relationship with everybody outside of work, but it's certainly okay to talk about the things that matter to you. In team meetings, we spend time, sounds small, but sharing family experiences or travel, literally spending the first 10 minutes of a meeting sharing photos of things that are important to us as we kind of start our week off and start our work day. So little things like that really matter to staff.
I love that, Katrina. I know that one of the people on my team, she has a newborn, and sometimes just seeing that baby, right? It's a mood elevator, and it can just be something. I mean, for some people, it's animals, puppy pictures, kitten pictures, like, and I think, when I started my professional career, I mean, nobody blended your personal life and your work life. It was very separate, and you were supposed to be all on when you were at work, right? But we're whole people. And I think really the more you look at people as whole people and you allow people to be whole people and you understand the other parts of a person, it helps us all be, more aware and understand and happier too. Bernard, your thoughts on self-care?
I think there is a huge importance for managers and directors in their departments to kind of lead by example during this thing. I know that, some of my managers have kind of stuck in my head on how they've really kind of navigated their work life here. Because at the end of the day, we're all people. And I remember she was the director of finance. She had all these things to do. She already knew that a day that she was going to stay there till midnight. And like in the middle of it, she just like took a rock from a previous like self-care like group project that we did, and she took out some paint and she's like, I'm gonna paint my rock for the next like 20 minutes. I was like, is it like really, like what are you doing? And she's like, I'm just not feeling it right now. And she just kind of embraced that 20-minute break to herself, and kind of pave the way for other people to kind of say like, I need a breather, I need to go for a walk, or I'm going to take like an extended lunch because my work is going to get done at the end of the day. It might not be at 5, but I think one of our other main policies is that if people work over hours, that we flex those hours back almost immediately, if not within the next week or so. So if someone works 5 hours extra one day, they get to leave 5 hours early on Friday. Or if it's on Friday, they get to spread those hours out so that they never feel like work is taking time kind of away from them, and that we're making sure like, hey, make sure that you take those 2 hours off. I know that you helped out on a project. And there were a lot of things that prior to directors and managers kind of showing that this was okay to do, people would have like 1 a.m. nights sometimes at the office. Since then, I don't think anyone stayed past like, not in the office anyway, because they would take some stuff to work, but we definitely would kind of see like all hands on deck. If 2 people stayed to help, that 1 a.m. like night, they were probably off by 7. And people didn't really it encouraged people to kind of work together and come together, because we knew that at the end of the day, we all flexed. Sometimes someone wasn't there and we could, and that was fine, because super secret thing about nonprofit work is there's always going to be work to do. So it never runs out.
And I think that that's so important. I having always been an overachiever personally and sharing from my own personal experience, right? You get to that point where the burnout's real. Like, that you are forcing yourself. If you're really in tune with yourself, you're forcing yourself to try to keep working, and it's not productive. It's not, you're not getting much done in the time you're devoting. And so you could sit there for 2 hours and do 5 minutes worth of work. And so really that idea of stepping away and painting a rock and then coming back, because it's going to be there, and hopefully you have a little bit of a team or a support system too. I think when we think about self-care, really making sure that you've got somebody within your organization to lean on, whether that be your higher leadership, whether that be your board of directors, whether that be outside resources, or even one person I know, she just needed to run, And if she ran, she felt better. So, you know, doing those things to help refill our own personal bucket, incredibly important, and really knowing what brings you great joy. One of the things I know during the pandemic that I had gotten away from was music. I used to love, when I was a teenager, just loved music. And so I've started being more intentional about playing music in the background because it's an elevator and it just helps lift my mood. It helps give me a more positive attitude. So I encourage everyone to find what works for you. And we will be sharing some resources and other programs that might be useful to you too. I would ask, as we do look out for other people around us. I know some of our participants are in very small teams. Some might be in larger teams. All of you come from some larger organizations and have seen kind of a lot of different perspectives. But are there signs that might alert us if one of our co-workers in particular is struggling with mental wellness?
Well, maybe I'll just
Oh,
address
go
some
for
of
it.
the obvious things that come through the HR department. We need to stop looking or start looking differently at the first performance conversation. When you have a high performer, even a solid performer that has already or begun to show signs of an attendance issue or being punctual when they're always on time or their performance is slipping, our default conversation was immediately to the numbers, to the productivity, or to the quality, instead of having the conversation around how are you doing? Is there something that we can assist with? Even the way we use our language in those first conversations that leaders may have with employees when they see a change in their work performance is going to be key. But some of those things are indicators, a change in how they show up, how a staff person or an employee might show up in a business meeting. If they're often very communicative and you notice that their communication has lessened significantly, they're not talking as much, they're not sharing as many ideas, or they're talking and sharing very differently. I've had a couple of one-on-ones with a staff member before that seemed a lot more combative than before. And before I got on the defense, I needed to look at what I knew about the individual and the fact that something must be happening outside of our work relationship to affect that. So I think it starts with hearing people and maybe setting up a different, again, and I think this is a running theme in my messaging, but setting up a different language for that first conversation when you notice that something's different in a performance situation.
Nuances in language are so important.
Very quickly, I think one of the things that you could do that requires a little less intuition on like reading people, look at PTO. If it's maxed out, why is that person saving it up? Is there like a big event or a vacation coming up that they're saving it for, or are they working a lot and forgetting to take time off and taking time to breathe? Sometimes people just need the reminder and say like, hey, you have a lot of PTO that you could take. We are not in our busy season right now. You can afford to take time off. Those people will really appreciate it, especially when you do hit those busy seasons. They will be refreshed, or like if they know when those things are going to come, can better, you know, plan around it and use their time accordingly.
I wanted to mention as well that somebody's saying like they're struggling or they feel like they're drowning in their workload. If I'm, because quite a few of my employees are remote, like if I notice that somebody's wearing the same sweatshirt like all week, like that could be fine, but also if that's different for that person, what's going on there? Also, if they, Hope for the Day has a bunch of little mini check-ins where you can come in and just kind of chat with your coworkers as people, because a lot of us don't see each other face to face as often. If they're suddenly not going to those anymore because they just simply don't feel like they have time to make space for that, or sometimes I've noticed people get kind of snappy in emails or on Slack, like the defensiveness starts showing up. Just all of those changes in maybe they're creating work that just isn't as high performing as it once was. But it's all about that shift in that person's individual experience, because as much as I would like to say there's like these 5 things you have to watch out for, everybody's very different. And when I hit a burnout, I am still overperforming, but when I get done with my work day, I can't do anything else in my personal life. Like I am drained. So often people don't notice at work, but then my partner, when I'm at home, they're like, are you okay? Because you don't want to make dinner, you don't want to figure out what to do next. So making sure that people are making space to do things outside of work on top of doing the work that they're doing is helpful.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really great value in that. I mean, I think and I think, you know, I've seen some organizations in the remote environment, they're really distant from their team. They're letting everybody just kind of be an island and do their stuff. I think understanding people, I think we're all learning a lot about ourselves. I've watched one person who really needed to be more with people, and Zoom wasn't feeding that, right? That's something that a lot of people have been talking about. I've also, I think, Allison, you bring up a great point about some of those social check-ins, you know, giving a place where, you know, again, just using Big Buzz as an example, we have the first Friday, we used to do something every Friday. As the pandemic has droned on, that got to be a little bit too much. And now we, you know, we have first Fridays and we alternate between team lunches and, you know, happy hours. They're not requirements, but they're a way for that personal connection to still come into play. I think more of those, you know, meet up with your team, 15-minute call with a team member, because we still want that camaraderie. We still want that collaborative spirit. We still want people to understand and know each other. So I do think, and, you know, definitely just allowing a space where it's not always about the organization and the work, but it's how are you doing? You know, this has gone on for a long time now. Like, how are you feeling these days? Do you have something you're looking forward to? You know, sometimes that having something on the horizon can really make a big difference for people too. So love it. I would love, I know again, that we're talking about some resources that are going to be going out. And I know we have some very small organizations on today, and I don't know how large they all get, but you know, I know there's a pretty broad spectrum. I would love to know what resources you are aware of and you could suggest or share with people to help anybody that might be in need in doing more work around mental wellness in their space.
I mean, all the stuff I do is mental health education and suicide prevention. So we have on our, and I know this will be sent out after this, but on our site, we have these cards. And this one has hotlines on it, but also we in our education talk about how to be supportive and what phrasing is helpful as like either a manager or a friend or a family member to continue the conversation instead of just shutting that person down, which I really love. It's things like, you don't have to talk if you don't want to, but I'm here if, and I can, and I want to listen if you realize that you want to have a conversation later. Yeah, hftd.org has a bunch of resources. We just recently put up there on top of signs someone may be struggling, we also have how to ask for help, because we realized that it was a little imbalanced, that we were always looking for other people, but like, how do you as a person ask for assistance? So I think that that's really helpful too.
I want to add on that. I think that that's key. You know, sometimes, your online training video, is that also available to people to sign up for?
Yeah, if you go to peervention.org, we have free educations that you can take. And we also have a part 2 of our like base education that makes you a better active listener, makes you realize how to have really difficult conversations. And they're really awkward, but I've taught now 2 of those public sessions because it started in February, but people like sitting in a space and actually thinking about what active listening looks like, where you're not on your phone or you're not like checking your email. It's really helpful, both in your personal life and at work.
And that's what made me think of it is, I know, right? Sometimes we think we're listening and we think we're helping, but we can actually be shutting somebody down without even realizing it. And so I think that those resources are really valuable, and I'm excited to share those with everybody following today. Katrina Bernard, thoughts on resources?
Yeah, I mean, from an employee perspective, I think I mentioned employee resource groups earlier, but having a place, if your organization has employee resources groups where you can feel aligned and connected and to do check-ins is really important. And I don't know, some smaller organizations may not have them, some may not have, you may be interested in starting your own. And your human resources team should be able to kind of help support that while not being, necessarily a part of it. Now, I'll also say one of the things that we're excited about, I mean, we're a smaller organization, we have a benefit broker partner, and within many of those health plans, there's an opportunity to look at augmenting those plans for employees. So we've been able to provide 100% free mental wellness services for our employees. And sometimes services are there. I guess one of the first things I want to say to employees is to encourage them, ask. You're an employee and you don't know about some offerings of your organization, check in and find out what those are. And I can tell you that the teletherapy is going through the roof in terms of utilization for our employees right now. And it's important for everybody to know that that's available to them. So those are some of the things that we have going on from an employee program offering space.
I guess I would recall from like a previous organization where I was, where we were a group of just 3 employees, a supervisor, myself, and we had one secretary. Uh, it really was kind of like a small town, like familial setting. So a lot of it was, that's the advantage of smaller teams is, I think it gets self-care becomes less of a buzzword and more of a kind of like more personal level when you can go on break with your boss and just really talk about like, hey, like kind of coach me through like this workload. How did you, kind of go through it? For people in like larger organizations, I think whenever we had like meet and greets, my first question was like, what kept you here for so long? Like what keeps you here? And you get a lot of good nuggets from people on, whether it's I was able to negotiate like increased PTO accrual in lieu of like a larger like salary increase, for example. You got a lot of really good tips on what kind of has worked for other people. Um, Outside, again, I think Katrina's right, is you definitely should see what like health insurance providers can give to your organization. And then here at Between Friends, what we've actually kind of started to do is we have a wellness and well-being committee where it's a group of, managers, supervisors, and like entry-level staff who kind of get together and we talk about issues that we would like to see improved at Between Friends, whether it's language in our handbook that needs to kind of be updated, or dress code policies that we think need to be rewritten or updated for today's world. Um, uh, Discussing the importance of like healthcare benefits. Do we think you know what are the benefits or what are the positives and negatives that we've experienced so that we have like a list that we can bring to our providers. I think those kinds of groups are very powerful in getting a lot of both fresh eyes and kind of people who are higher level can kind of see like, oh yeah, this is something that might take a little longer for us to implement because of like red tape that's kind of who needs to approve things like that, but you can see what really is important for people at the organization.
I think that's so valuable, making space for it, right? And sharing ideas and resources, sometimes even like maybe having a company list that you can keep having people, you know, in the old days, right? We might have a whiteboard or a bulletin board in the kitchen where you could kind of have a list of ways to take care of yourself and maybe keep adding to it, or what I did this weekend and like share something personal. But you can still do that even in these small settings, no matter what the size of your team. It could be a matter of being able to just have a list that you keep reviewing on a regular basis and have people add what's working for them to share ideas. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. So as our time winds down, to try to make the most of this time, we're going to try to do some kind of a lightning round of questions. And I'm going to combine a couple. I know that there are some people talking about kind of if you have a legacy manager who maybe has been in their role for a long time, you know, and trying to kind of get them to maybe look at this a little differently than what they've done over the years. And one of the other questions was also about, you know, what about those team members that you work with who might think this is fluffy nonsense? You know, in a small team, 1 or 2 dissenters can make a really big difference if there's only 3 to 5 of you, versus a larger organization where maybe leadership is on board and they're helping to drive it. So I'd love to get some thoughts about how you start to change the culture in an organization and maybe start to bring along anybody who's a bit of a doubter.
Oh, I'm so in. I'm ready. So this is like one of the things I love talking about is that because I came from a super toxic workplace environment in my previous life, what motivates that person? So what motivates me is always like making sure people feel included and we're getting all the educational aspects and making sure that we're making the best product we can for these conversations. But what may motivate someone else who's a legacy is like, how does that help my ROI? How does that help like my org? And coming in from that viewpoint might be a really helpful way. It's painful for me because I'm like, I just want people to feel like they belong. And you're like, that's great, but like, what's this doing for me? So I think figuring out someone's motivation and then also having allies and buy-in, because if there's enough people in the org that agree with what the changes that want to be made, eventually they kind of don't have a choice. So I know that sounds kind of pushy, but it's one of those things where you're making sure that you are coming in at the angle where that person is concerned and then proving that having a more diverse team is really helpful. Making sure people have time off creates X, like setting it up to be what they want it to be and the challenges that they're already experiencing. But yeah, I think that's really helpful.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Allison. Just kind of that pushiness does need to show up in some of our structural items. And, you know, I think that the first thing that helps an organization is to start that conversation at the C-suite level. I mean, when you're talking about return on investment, you need to be talking about, you know, employee engagement, which includes, I think I mentioned, we have a huge component of mental wellness. We're actually intentionally taking the core values of our organization, which includes compassion, defining how that looks for internal employees, and then placing that into our performance assessment tool to say, these are the behaviors that we want to see from the C-suite down, and this is how we feel it looks. And then assessing and providing performance coaching on those behaviors. It's still a work in progress. We're still trying to come up with some language about that, but it's accountability from all levels of the organization that's going to make this work. And just like we cascade goals, you know, the organization needs to increase by 20% in revenue. What is your particular part in that? We're cascading this idea of compassion. How do you show it internally and what that shows up and looks like? So I think that's the way, you know, you kind of have to change your models and your programs to fit to fit the strategy and to fit the objective that you want to see, which is wellness for all of your employees.
I think it's also important to kind of, for like those data-driven, you know, legacy C-suite people, is kind of tell them like, you know, this is the cost of replacing an employee. You know, there are some people who would have stayed if they didn't need, they might be making significantly more at like another organization, but would have stayed because they value like the culture at a higher level and they really just needed like a smaller raise or just to be listened to kind of give them some slack during like a hard time in their life. I think it's also really important to for the buy-in is say like, look, you know, you have to also look at certain employees who I have seen as kind of like the core of like a group a group of people. If that person leaves, that is the only person stopping like 3 or 4 other people to also want to leave the organization. So just kind of like listening to the pulse of what employees are asking for and being more flexible with things they want. You know, for data-driven people, it's just kind of like, look, at the end of the day, if X, Y, and Z people leave, all of their work is going to eventually fall onto you. And nobody wants any of that. Especially with like the hiring pool as it is today, it's really difficult to find um, candidates because people have the power to shop around. And I think the culture of your organization is what's really going to set you apart if and when, you know, just some organizations just can't provide more money. So the culture and the environment is what's really going to separate yourself from other people.
And I want to add in on that too, Bernard. I think that's such a huge point, right? Like, how often do we think we have to stay in a toxic environment versus all of you have organizations that are nonprofit that are actually working in a much more supportive environment. And I'm finding more and more organizations driving that way because we do value the people who are doing such great work to lift up, you know, whatever industry you're serving, whatever audience community that is you're reaching, you know, to really continue to be able to be devoted to them. And I think the other thing I would add to the conversation that you guys have broached upon here, but having the conversations and realizing that each of us as individuals have a voice, you know, it doesn't have to be confrontational to go to your leader if they're maybe not thinking this way or broaching this, but rather go from a standpoint of like, hey, I'm really struggling. I love my job. I love the work, but it's heavy. Or, you know, just being honest and realizing that you want to, do you have tips for me? You know, it can be very conversational, very engaging. Like, I don't want to leave. I love what we do here, but I'm struggling a little bit right now. And knowing that that's okay, you know, and I really do think we have to continue to encourage managers to realize the value of holding on to good employees. Nobody wants to be losing people, good people right now at all. And so realizing we each have a responsibility internally too, to use our voice and be conversational. You don't have to be confrontational, and start a dialogue around this and start to lead the way. So we did have a couple more questions. I wish we had time to address them. I already have talked to these panelists about the fact of whether or not we might need a part 2 later this year on this topic. It's a huge one. I think it continues to be, as the pandemic just weighs on, it's front and center for a lot of people. I think being able to take care of ourselves and all of those in our lives, our families, our employees, our coworkers, whatever it might be, you know, trying to hold everybody to a better standard of, you know, falling more on the higher end of overall mental wellness is really important. So I want to give a very huge thank you to all of you this morning for being on this panel. I thank you for sharing your experience and your information with us, and we look forward to sharing resources out again this afternoon to all of you who joined us today. And if you do have any questions or want to follow up after this, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to also continue further engagement. Have a great day, everybody.